So, welcome back to another episode of the Empower Her Thriving Beyond Stress Mastery. My name is Pamela Pedrick. I am a registered nurse and a holistic nurse health coach, and I'm the creator and the host of Empower Her. Our next featured expert is Evan Hirsch, MD, who is also known as the Energy MD. He is a world renowned fatigue expert, best selling author, and professional speaker. He is the creator of EnergyMD Method, the science backed and clinically proven four-step process to resolving long COVID and chronic fatigue naturally. Through his best selling book, podcast, and international online program, he has helped thousands of people around the world resolve their fatigue, and he has been featured on TV, podcasts, and summits. Welcome, Dr. Evans. So happy to have you with us today.
Pamela, so thankful that you asked me to come on.
And so we're going to talk about your four-step process to resolving chronic fatigue naturally. But first, for those who aren't familiar with you, and out of my own curiosity, how did you become the Energy MD? What led you into this work you're currently doing?
So I had my own story. My wife actually, we fell in love, and my wife got chronic fatigue syndrome, and I was going through my residency, and I felt incredibly disempowered, the opposite of your event. And because I was going through a family medicine residency and I was asking a bunch of practitioners how to help my wife or my girlfriend at that time, and they just didn't really have any answers. So I kind of went on a journey, from conventional medicine into holistic medicine and integrative medicine and functional medicine, environmental medicine, until I actually came to what I'm practicing today. But after she got sick, she got better after about 3 years, mostly better.
Wow.
And then a couple years after that, I got chronic fatigue syndrome, and it lasted for about 5 years and just about destroyed my life, my work, my relationships. I had a new daughter. I couldn't play with her. The shame that I had was incredible. I was napping underneath my desk. At that point, I was practicing functional medicine,
Mhm.
and I was napping underneath my desk every single day, and I had my door locked because I could help so many other people except for myself. So I finally realized that I had to go on my own journey to figure out all of the causes of the fatigue and the body pain and the brain fog that I was having in order to be able to get over it. And then I wrote a book about it, and that's become my life's work.
Wow, I can imagine 5 years of just wow. And
It was
for
rough.
those who aren't familiar with chronic fatigue, we've heard about it, but maybe they aren't familiar what exactly it is. Can you tell us what exactly is chronic fatigue, symptom-wise? What goes on in the
Yeah,
body?
yeah. So in its simplest form, it's a tiredness that's not relieved by rest. So you should be able to, if you're getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, you should have enough energy throughout the day to do
Mhm.
everything that you want to do. You shouldn't have to rely on naps or caffeine or crashing or,
Mhm.
whatever sort of modifications you have to do with your life in order to be able to function correctly and
Right.
be able to work and play and do all the things that you want to do. So,
Mhm.
and granted, a lot of the people that we work with have sleep issues, so you're not getting a good 7 to 9 hours
Yeah.
of sleep a night. So, when you think about there's acute fatigue, which is basically, when you exert yourself, you're going to feel tired, and maybe the next day you need to recover, but then you're back to baseline.
Mm.
So in these folks who have chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome and now long COVID as well,
Yeah.
they just never get back to baseline. You sleep as much as you possibly can, and your energy is drained, and you're just not able to function the way that you want to. So essentially, if you are more tired than you want to be, and you're using some of these coping mechanisms like caffeine and naps,
Mhm.
like I mentioned, it means that there's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Wow. And so I'm curious, like what percentage of the population, whether it be, chronic fatigue or long haul COVID, are impacted significantly by this energy issue that they have?
Yeah, so in the United States, it's more like about 5% that are actually officially
Oh.
diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome itself or myalgic encephalitis. And so this is a diagnosis where not a lot of people qualify for it
Mhm.
because it requires you to have 6 months worth of really debilitating chronic fatigue and what's called post-exertional malaise, where you exert yourself and you feel worse. You have to have brain fog or cognitive issues. You have to have sleep issues. You have to have body pain. There's a lot of people that we work with who don't have all of those things. So they just have chronic fatigue.
Hmm.
There was a study that was done, a workplace study by the National Safety Council a number of years ago, and they found that it was upwards of 67% of everybody in the workforce actually had significant symptoms of fatigue, whether they were
Wow.
napping at work or they were napping while they were driving
Hmm.
cars or some sort of symptom like that. So that's more along the lines of what we see. And most people, if you ask them if they'd like more energy, they'll raise their hands.
Hmm.
And it's unfortunately we're going to talk about today about the reasons why that's happening and why it's so prevalent. But there's definitely hope and there are definitely things that you can do in order to increase your energy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do surveys a lot with, the women that I come into contact with. And so the second issue they deal with is energy issues. Other than weight, it's energy, which is why I was like, yeah, someone who is actually proficient in this can speak, more to this. So I'm curious, you do have a four-step process. And how did you come to develop your four-step process? Because you're the first one I've heard actually have a process for resolving things. And I know you from your own personal experiences, but how'd you come with this four-step process and what is it?
So this came from a lot of trial and error over the last decade since I've been specializing in fatigue. And it was pretty much, what I was doing in my one-on-one work with folks. I was assessing for what they were coming in
Mhm.
for and figuring out what causes they had. So that's step one. Now, fortunately, of those causes, about 90% of all the causes that we look at, which we'll talk about today, can be determined by symptoms alone. So you really don't
Mhm.
need the $2,000 worth of laboratory tests that a lot of functional medicine practitioners are
Yeah.
recommending. You can really do so much just by your symptoms and your history. So the first step is to figure out the causes that somebody
Mhm.
has. And of those causes, I break them down into deficiencies and toxicities. Deficiencies are things that are not in the body that are supposed to be there.
Mhm.
Toxicities are things that are in the body that aren't supposed to be there. And you know, um, long story short, this process is really about removing the toxicities. But in order to get there, we kind of have to set the body up for success. So step four is removing the toxicities. But step two is to replace the deficiencies in hormones and vitamins and
Mhm.
minerals and nutrients and lifestyle habits, because all of those things are going to give people an uptick in energy. And oftentimes it can help a significant number of
Mhm.
people. Now, if they're still not better, we need to make sure that we're focused on the toxicities. But after we replace the deficiencies, then we go into step three, which is to open up the exit pathways. So this is all of the ways that we get toxins out of the body. This
Mhm.
is liver and kidneys and lymph and neurolymph, which is in the brain, and the gallbladder and the intestines, all of those ways that we get toxins out. And this is one of the major problems with a lot of people's protocols,
Mhm.
because when they try to remove toxins, and I call this the toxic five or the toxic soup, which is a combination of heavy metals and chemicals and molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction. So all of those, when people try to go directly at them and remove them, oftentimes people feel worse. And that's because they haven't spent enough time in step three, opening up those exit pathways. It's kind of like a funnel where, the rate at which you can detoxify is directly related to the width or how open
Mhm.
that funnel is. And so we do that in step three. And then in step four, it's removing that toxic five, which is really the root cause of 80% of all the other causes. When we're looking at hormone deficiency, adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones, mitochondrial dysfunction, which makes 70 to 90% of our energy, vitamin, mineral deficiencies, all of those are actually caused by the toxic five, the toxins that build up in our body that end up causing those
Mhm.
deficiencies. So even though in step two, we're replacing these deficiencies because the body works better when they're all optimized, we have to remember they're band-aids, but they're natural band-aids. And we still need to move through the process and make sure that we're getting rid of the root cause, which is the toxic five in step
Yeah.
four.
So I'm curious, of the toxic five, do those with chronic fatigue or long haul, do they have all five, or is there one that's more prevalent in the population you work with?
Great question. So with people who have chronic fatigue syndrome and long COVID, they have all five.
Mm,
It's not a question of if they have them, it's a question of how much of each do they have. And depending on, I mean, this is basically a story of the exposures that we've had throughout our lives. We start off getting toxicities from mom through the placenta.
mhm.
There are studies to show that over 300 different chemicals are found in baby's cord blood,
Wow.
right? So we know that we come out of the womb already behind the eight ball. And then, my story, which is pretty similar to a lot of the people that I speak with, is the exposures that you have along the way. So I ate a lot of tuna fish growing up, which has a lot of mercury in it. And then I ate a lot of gluten and dairy, which constipated me. So I had a bowel movement once a week for the first 20 some odd years of my life. So I couldn't get rid of the toxins out of my body. And for people who are not sure if they're constipated, you are if you're not having a bowel movement at least every day, hopefully twice a day. And then, I had additional exposures with the non-organic food that I was consuming. This was the 80s, like
Yep.
nobody knew about organic food. So there was pesticides and herbicides. And then, I kissed this person and that person, and I got Epstein-Barr virus, and I got bitten by ticks and mosquitoes, and I got Lyme disease, and I lived in a place where cats peed on cardboard boxes, and those boxes got moldy, and so consequently I was exposed to mold. And then I was exposed to formaldehyde, and had formaldehyde poisoning when I was in medical school. And then I had breakups and the stress of residency, and et cetera, et cetera. And it all becomes this toxic matrix of all these toxins that build up over time until the body says, "Hey, I'm done. I need to rest now." And so essentially, when people get fatigue, it's the body trying to protect itself. And we have to listen to the body, we have to rest, but we also have to address these causes in order to be able to get our energy back.
Yeah, you listed so much that I think a lot of us could resonate with. Growing up in the 80s, exposed to toxins and chemicals. I mean, I grew up in South Jersey, so we went camping every summer, and it was very, the things we used to do back in the day, like the mosquito fog machine. We would like play in the mosquito chemicals because
Right.
we're like, hey, we're going to hide and play in it as it was going down, the things that we did back in the day. So it's interesting that they have all five, but it's just depends on how much of each that they have. And so for someone who's going through this chronic fatigue and, from what you're saying is they have all five, it's like, oh my gosh, is there hope at the end of this? But you said that there is. So I'm curious, what is the first thing that you tend to do with your patients when you're, on your course of treatment, so to speak? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so in step after we figure out the causes that they have, we're essentially matching up um a support or a therapy or a
Mhm.
supplement for each of those causes to make sure that we address all of them. But the first thing is always going to be lifestyle habits. So, it's more about what you don't eat than what you do eat, in my opinion. So it's kind of like avoiding gluten and dairy and sugars and really focusing on meat and vegetables, or at least protein and vegetables, really good fats. That can make a huge difference for folks and, decrease their inflammation, as you know, and so many people listening know. So that's the first thing. And then the other piece that's so important, I find, is really the mindset work and the nervous system retraining,
Mm,
which we have now incorporated into our program over the last 6 months since I've seen so many remarkable changes that people have had. So oftentimes this can be things like meditation and mindfulness and breath work. And then also the mindset work, gratitudes, and envisioning your ideal day and your ideal life, and looking at any sort of limiting beliefs that you have and flipping them into empowering beliefs, and looking at what sort of negative or disempowering questions you're asking yourself and flipping them into empowering questions. For example, are you asking yourself, like, why is this happening to me?
mhm.
Well, unfortunately, the brain is a goal-achieving machine, and if you ask it a question, it's going to give you an answer. And if you don't ask it a very supportive question, you're not going to like the answer that you get. So you need to ask a better question like, how can I love myself even more today? Right? Or
Yes.
what can I do today to move forward in my health journey? Right? So those are just some examples, but lifestyle habits, working on the mindset, and then, depending on how people react to that, I mean, with my program, we're doing everything because I'm kind of like, people have
Mhm.
done a lot when they're coming to see me.
Yes.
And so they really, the way that I know that if I can help people is if they haven't addressed the toxic five. And in general, they've replaced the deficiencies, they've worked on the lifestyle habits because they've seen naturopaths and functional medicine docs and integrative medicine docs. But it's really the toxic five where a lot of practitioners don't have their comfort with because they can get 90% of the people who walk through their door better just by focusing on the deficiencies, which is wonderful. It just doesn't help the small percentage of those people who, like me, when I had my chronic fatigue syndrome, and now the people with long COVID, it's just more advanced, and so that's kind of like where we can really help folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so encouraging to hear and Reese had comment and oh my gosh, the fact that you've reversed all of this is phenomenal.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, how long did it take you? How long was your healing journey?
So my healing journey was 5 years, and I went from provider to provider and talked to a bunch of my friends and colleagues and trying to figure it out. And I was, like I said, practicing functional medicine, and I had to go to environmental medicine. I mean, essentially, I had to get a PhD in the toxic five, in the
Mm,
heavy metals and the chemicals and the molds and the infections and the nervous system dysfunction in order to be able to start to heal that in myself and to get better and then to be able to help others because each of those is just it's just a lot of information. And
yeah.
like I said, a lot of practitioners, if you don't have to go there, you don't want to necessarily go there. Like I didn't want to
Hmm.
treat Lyme. I didn't want to know how to treat parasites. I didn't want to know how to treat the nervous system dysfunction. But when I had to do it for myself, and I kept getting slapped in the face with it, with people who were coming to see me who had chronic fatigue. And every time I couldn't get somebody better, I was asking, what am I missing?
Hmm.
And then I go back to the drawing board and doing more
Yeah.
research and figuring out, okay, well, is it this? And then we apply that and we see, oh yeah, it definitely could be that, And so um, that's what I found to be most helpful. And I'd love to talk about some of the challenges with laboratory testing if that would be helpful.
Oh, absolutely. Dawn did have a question. She says, I've heard of most of them. What is nervous system dysfunction?
So every human alive has nervous system dysfunction essentially. And so it's basically anything that's happened to you in your life that has made you feel like the world is not a safe place. So this can happen because you were raised by imperfect humans, considered to be your parents. It could be that you grew up with siblings who are all kind of vying for parents' attention and affection. You're trying to get your needs met as a human. Um, it could be because you grew up with other imperfect humans who were your peers in elementary school or middle school or high school, and they're all just trying to get their needs met and trying to navigate the world, right? But the reality is that it ends up contributing to, you don't have to have really significant abuse like sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse. You can have things that are potentially considered more mild like I had, rejection of a peer group or being raised by these imperfect humans. I love my parents. I always grew up with love, but they're still imperfect. And consequently, I had to navigate their challenges in order to get my needs met, right? The idea as we're growing up as children is that we're programmed to survive. And so we're going to do whatever we can in order to survive in the environment. And those tools that we learn to survive serve us then, but they no longer serve us now. It's the reason why we have challenges in relationships. Relationships are incredibly complex and they're uncomfortable. And most of us have challenges sitting in that discomfort when somebody says something that triggers us and we respond from that place of a wounded child, right? If we can sit there and we can be curious and we can be like, oh, you just said this thing and it hurts me and I feel it inside and I'm curious about it, right? That really changes the way that you can have this relationship with this person. You don't have to necessarily take it personally. So, we all have that wounding, and that's the nervous system dysfunction. And that's why there's a whole bunch of programs out there around nervous system retraining or brain retraining in order to retrain your nervous system for better health. And I tell people that we don't know if nervous system dysfunction is 90% of your issue or 10% of your issue. So we have to make sure that we're addressing it. Because I've seen people who come to me with like mast cell activation syndrome where they can barely eat any foods. They've got awful chronic fatigue syndrome, body pain, fatigue, brain fog. They do the nervous system retraining work and they're 90% better in 6 months
Wow.
just from doing that work. So that's why we've kind of included it in our program. And so that's really like the fastest way to get better. So I always recommend, kind of start there. Um, and there's like the Gupta program and Primal
Mhm.
Trust, and there's DNRS with Annie Hopper, Dynamic Neural Retraining System. There's a couple of other ones out there, but those are kind of the big ones that I generally recommend to folks where they're low cost, they can really help no matter what you're dealing with. And then I tell them if you're still having issues, then come see me because there's the other components of the toxic five that are still present that you have to get rid of. So generally people will have an improvement of,
Mhm.
10 to 90% in some cases by doing the nervous system retraining, and then they come to us and they get the rest cleaned up.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Thank you for that question, Dawn. Appreciate
Yeah.
that one. Yeah. So you're going to talk about labs.
Yeah, so a lot of practitioners recommend a lot of labs. We don't.
Mhm.
And part of that is because I've been doing this for a decade, and what I found is that in doing a lot of testing, is that all the people that I see with chronic fatigue syndrome, and long COVID all have all of the toxic five, the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, and the nervous system dysfunction. So it just makes the sense from time, energy, and money to treat all of those, make sure we're not missing anything. The challenge also associated with the laboratory testing, where we've tested people and it shows up, no, you don't have any mold. And then, 12 months later, we retest and all of a sudden they have mold again.
Mm,
And the reason why is because most of the testing that's done for a lot of these toxins are urine tests. And these tests are really tests of excretion. So they're looking at the ability of the human to get the toxins out of their body. They're not tests for what your total body burden is.
mhm.
Consequently, when people move through the process and they're in step 3 and step 4, and then we're starting to mobilize things and open up pathways, all of a sudden you're excreting a lot more. So when somebody gets a test initially, or they get a test whatever they are in the process, and it doesn't show anything, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have those toxins. The other thing is that the toxins are all bound to each other. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes we don't see it in the urine, is because you have to actually remove the heavy metals in order for the chemicals to get released and in order for them to show up in the urine. So it just makes more sense to treat. The other thing when it comes to the infections is that most of the testing is serology testing, which means that we're looking at the immune system's reaction to an infection. When you have the toxic five, your immune system is dysfunctional by definition. So then we're basically asking a dysfunctional immune system to give us an accurate read on the test. So once again, I've been burned where we do this testing,
Mm.
doesn't show up, and then we test 6 or 12 months later, and then all of a sudden it shows up. And it would have made a lot more sense to just treat it as we're moving through the process, leave no stone unturned, make sure that we're addressing all these, 95% of all the potential causes out there so that we can get to the finish line.
Gotcha. Makes sense to me. Absolutely.
And
I
I
was
grew
gonna,
up in northern Jersey, so just let me know if I'm talking too fast.
yeah. So back in our camping days in South Jersey, yep, mosquito truck
Yeah.
that went around to get the mosquitoes with the chemicals. Yeah.
Mhm.
So talked about the toxic five. You don't test because pretty much everyone has it from your experience. And then I was gonna say because if they're not offloading, then you're not gonna find it in the urine. And I'm one of those where my detox pathways were clamped down, and I got really sick from detoxes and cleanses. Been there, done that. Did not want to do it until I learned, oh my gosh, my detox pathways aren't open up as well.
Nice.
Any questions for Dr. Evan? Because this energy is an issue for a lot of people. So you'd mentioned the long haul COVID. When did you start working with that specific population? I'm curious. Was it just they were looking for energy and you found that it was long COVID or?
So we're uniquely positioned to address long COVID because essentially it's the toxic five plus the spike protein.
Mhm.
So I just had to learn how to address the spike protein because A lot of people, they'll do like the FLCCC protocol for the spike protein or one of those, and they don't get better and they're wondering why. And the
Mhm,
reality is because they had the other spike protein, or sorry, the other toxic five. And so,
mhm,
with the toxic five, they basically set the stage and then something becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. So people will say, "Oh, I know that it happened after I got COVID," or
yeah,
"I know that it happened after I got Epstein-Barr or mono. I've never been the same." Or I know that it happened after I lived in that moldy place. But it's rarely just that one thing. It's almost never. And the reality is that it's always this combination of these other things that end up building up in the body. And then that
mhm,
that one thing that people identify as kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back.
yeah,
But in terms of long COVID, once we figured out that there was a long COVID about 6 to 12 months into COVID, so
mhm,
this is like towards the end of 2020, I launched a long COVID program. We started helping people with it. We saw that we could be of service, and we launched a long COVID program. But it's really not until the last year where all of a sudden we've had a lot more people. And the reason
mhm,
why is because I think it's been this progression. What I'm seeing is that people start off where they've never really been sick before. They start to get these weird symptoms. They go to their conventional doctor and they give them 6 months to help them, and the conventional doctor really can't help. And then they refer them to a long COVID clinic, and they're there for another 6 to 12 months. And then these people start thinking outside the box, and so they start going more holistic, and they go to nutritionists and holistic and functional medicine and
mhm,
environmental medicine and all those things. And they do that for another 6 to 12 months. And then they're like, well, why don't I just start searching for long COVID specialists? There's got to be some of those out there, and then they find us, right? So it's this progression of people who sometimes start off really conventional and then they go through this process about not being helped through different
mhm.
systems or helped a little bit and then they plateau until they realize that they just have to search for their particular condition and find an expert who's in that.
Wow, that makes sense, and unfortunately, I'm curious, what of those who do get COVID, what is the percent that it actually goes into long COVID?
Yeah, so it's about 35% or so, depending on which stats you read. For some studies it says 40%. The CDC says 1 in 5, so 20%. But it's quite a bit. There's also quite a bit of mental health that we're seeing, and there's over
Mhm,
250 different symptoms that people can have from COVID, long COVID, spike protein,
mhm,
the jab. All of those things will end up causing different symptoms based on where the spike protein goes in the body. So if it goes into the muscles, you get inflammation in the muscles and you get muscle pain. If it goes into the
gotcha.
brain, you can get brain fog and you can get brain fatigue and you can get mental health issues. There was one study of 265,000 people where they followed them 6 months after they got COVID, and 35% of them had a new mental health diagnosis. So this is depression, anxiety, even bipolar and schizophrenia, but it was mainly depression and anxiety. So, it can really affect so many different parts of the body. And so I tell people any new symptom that you've had since 2020, you have to consider that it's related to COVID or the spike protein.
Interesting. That statistic that you threw out, well, over 265,000, that statistic just floored me right there.
Right. Yeah, they looked at some electronic medical record. That's how they were able to get that data from so many different people.
Wow. So any new symptom, potentially long COVID, is what's going on. And because I'm starting, like you, I'm kind of starting to hear more people, having it versus, prior to early on when the whole ish kind of came out, so to speak. So I'm curious because maybe someone doesn't know. Oh, Risa, great question. What are your thoughts on shedding?
I think shedding is a real phenomenon. I don't think that we understand it. But I do recommend if people are going to be around people who they believe are shedding, that they take preventive cautions,
Mhm.
and this is oftentimes going to be some of the treatments for the spike protein, especially.
Great question. Any
Yeah,
other
great question.
questions for Dr. Eben? So other, we talked about chronic fatigue and long haul COVID. Are there any other kind of, I don't want to say symptoms, disease processes that would definitely present kind of like chronic fatigue?
So in terms of, thyroid is a real big one that a lot of people don't
Mhm.
understand, can be related. People can have hair loss, weight gain. A lot of this can also happen around menopause.
Mhm.
Women are particularly susceptible after 50, at least for the chronic fatigue syndrome. The long COVID is really more of young people who are athletic.
Oh,
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I actually just got a new client who is in college and he ran track for his university and got COVID and now can barely get out of bed.
wow.
And oftentimes it's more of the younger population because there's something around, and it's more of the athletic population and people who are training for marathons, running a
Mhm.
lot, really athletic because they go back to doing that too soon. And the COVID is still in the mitochondria, which makes 70 to 90% of our energy, and it's taking over the production of the DNA in the mitochondria. And then all of a sudden, you're asking the mitochondria to produce a bunch of DNA, and now
Mhm.
this DNA has all been spliced with the spike protein and it just goes everywhere in the body. So that's one of the things we're seeing. But women coming back to that and being in perimenopause or menopause, you know, the hormones really are a three-legged stool where you need the adrenals, the thyroid, and the sex hormones to all be functional in order for optimal function in the body. And when the ovaries go quiescent in women or testes in men, you're going to, the thyroid and the adrenals have to step up. And if you have chronic stress in the bottle, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical,
Mhm.
like the toxic five, that's going to stress out the adrenals. They're not going to function correctly. And then everything falls on the thyroid, and the thyroid can't hold everything up. And so we go through a process of repairing the thyroid with addressing the adrenals and the mitochondria, which make the thyroid work better. And then we do what we call a subjective thyroid ramp up. We're increasing the thyroid by a little bit at a time every 2 weeks until we get people up to their ideal dose. And it saves a ton of time, energy, and money. Um, and and it really helps with decreasing overall inflammation.
Mhm.
Thyroid optimized helps decrease cholesterol, decrease blood pressure. I recently did a video on my YouTube channel about the best medication for high cholesterol, and it really is thyroid. And a lot of people aren't aware of that, and it doesn't have the side effects of a number of the statin medications.
Interesting. Awesome. So, repeat again, what are the toxic five?
So the toxic five are a combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction. And I can go into each one of those if you like. I think we've got some
Oh,
additional
we
time
yeah, we
here.
got some time. Absolutely.
Great. So, when I was telling my story, I was talking about, the the tuna fish that I used to eat a lot growing up, and that's very heavy in heavy metals. And pretty much, unfortunately, everything that comes out of the oceans these days has mercury in it. And that's because mercury vapor from coal plants ends up settling in the oceans. And so, yes, we are decreasing coal plants in this country, but there's plenty of other countries that are still doing it for producing power. And so, unfortunately, that's the case. And so, any fish can do that. And so, when it comes to fish, I recommend consuming smaller fishies, whether it's sardines or anchovies, if you are going to consume them, or just eating them on a not so frequent basis, or combining it with taking some sort of binder or some sort of heavy metal natural chelator like chlorella or zeolite or something like that, so that as you're consuming your salmon, and I live in the Pacific Northwest now, so it's challenging when you have such good fish up here, to not consume it. And my daughter actually loves salmon. I'm okay not consuming it. Um, and she also really loves sushi. And so it's like, okay, we can do sushi a couple of times a year, and here's what you're going to take when you consume it. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
um, just trying to be human about all that with her. So that's some of the heavy metals. Also, cadmium comes from smoking. And then lead paint, any home that you're in that it was built before the 70s is going to have lead paint behind all the other paint that has been painted over that lead paint. And so it can end up in the dust, which, babies are most susceptible to crawling around. And then in terms of the chemicals, there's over 90,000 different chemicals that we're exposed to on a regular basis. Most of those have not been appropriately assessed by the FDA and other governing bodies. I know I'm full of great positive information today, right? But the reality is that, you can do something about all these things. It's all about just having the knowledge and then slowly over the next year to start to decrease your exposure to a lot of these things, And so of those 90,000 different chemicals, the stats are that women are exposed to about 500 different chemicals before they leave the house in the morning from all the cosmetics, and men about 300 different chemicals. And these are everything from the soaps that we use in the kitchen to the cosmetics to the shampoos to whatever, right? So those are all the exposures that we want to decrease our exposure to. And then the molds are found in pretty much half of all the buildings in the world. And most of those, so half of the buildings in all the world have water damage, and most of those have molds in them, among other things. And so consequently, any building that you've ever lived in that had water damage could have caused some mold. So, if you had mold when you were 5 years, if you lived in a place for 6 months or so, significant mold exposure when you were 5 years old, that mold is still in your body today. It's just another one of those stressful hits that kind of ended up causing the symptoms that you have today if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, or long COVID. So they still have to be removed. And so, some of the main testing that we recommend that people get is determining if they're living in a moldy home. And sometimes the home is fine, and it's from a previous home and still has to be addressed. So, removing mold from the body is really a two-step process. You have to decrease your exposure so you can't be living in it, and then you have to remove it from the body. So that's mold. And then in terms of the infections, whether it's Epstein-Barr virus, whether it's Lyme disease, Bartonella, Babesia, Borrelia itself, parasites, all of those infections we come into contact throughout our lives. Oftentimes they become opportunistic because of the other toxic five that are present. When you have heavy metals, chemicals, and molds, your immune system is dysfunctional, and you need a somewhat intact functional immune system in order to be able to get rid of the infections out of the body, whether it's all those I mentioned or COVID or etc. So it's really important to make sure that all of those are being addressed through the process. And then we talked about the nervous system dysfunction and how important it is to do nervous system retraining. So, consequently, our program is really structured on what I believe success looks like. So it's like, what causes do you have? Here's the solution to each one of those causes. You implement those. And then when you have questions or bumps in the road, we provide you with really excellent support. So you can get a face-to-face time with me almost every single week in our program. And I guarantee an answer to any questions that people have in our community, guaranteed 2 business days. So whoever you work with, it's just really important to make sure that you're addressing all of your causes and that they provide a ton of support so that you can get your questions answered. Because it's really, the process of getting better is really a process of pivoting. I would imagine people have had issues before where they start a supplement, they feel worse, they ask a question, and they don't get an answer that's adequate in order to help them pivot. If you did get an answer that worked for you, you could pivot and continue to move forward and eventually get to your goal. So there's always going to be bumps in the road. You just have to make sure that you're working with somebody who has the answers so that you can keep pivoting so that eventually you can reach the finish line. So that's my advice on what you should be looking for in a provider.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I did put your website in the chat if anyone wants to visit the website, and the link to Dr. Evans' gift. So tell us about your gift, your master class.
Yeah, so the masterclass goes deeper into my philosophy of care, the 4-step process, who I can help, who I can't help. And then people have the option of getting on a free call with me, which is, part of that value to where on that call, I'll assess what you've had done, see if I can help you, see if you're a good fit for what we offer. About half of the people that I get on the calls with, I tell them that I don't believe that I can help them or if they're a good fit. So, it's not a guarantee that I think that they're a good fit for the program.
Yeah. And you also have a bonus gift that's in our all access pass, the Fix Your Fatigue book. Tell us about that one.
Exactly. So yeah, so that's a PDF of my bestseller on Amazon that was written back in 1917, in 2017. And so that one's a couple years on it, but it still has a lot of good information, goes into more depth on everything that I've discussed here. And so it provides a lot of the information that we discussed. But the most important thing really is about implementation, and so when you're ready to get better, whether you're working with me or you're working with Pamela, you want to make sure that you implement, because that's really the only way to transformation and success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dawn was Dawn just commented, I was thinking the opposite. You have real life, real explanations in normal convo. Any questions for Dr. Evan? We do have a couple minutes for a couple questions. You can just put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Karen, go ahead.
Oh, yes. I came late, so if you already had it, I could listen to the recording. But you said to do nervous system retraining.
Correct. Yeah. So nervous system retraining or brain retraining, we had that in our program for people who are going through it to address all of the toxic five. But if you just wanted to start with a program like that, whether it's the Gupta program or whether it's the Primal Trust or the DNRS by Annie Hopper. Those are kind of the big ones that are available right now. Oftentimes people will do those for 6 months, see what kind of benefit they get, and then they come over to us for the rest of the Toxic Five if they're still not 100%.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? You put what he just said in the chat,
I can
Dawn?
propose it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think I even have a link for the Gupta program.
Oh, cool.
So Primal Trust, Gupta, and the DNRS by Andy Hopper. Yeah, so it's pretty much, um, explore those different options, see who you resonate with, and then go for it, do it for 6 months. I would say that uh, DNRS was the first one that I learned about, and Annie Hopper is great. She's also a lot more strict on the recommendations. You kind of have to do it an hour a day, and there's a lot of things that you need to do, and so you have to see if that fits with your personality. Gupta is a little bit more flexible. I think Primal Trust is also a bit more flexible, but sometimes, yeah, I mean, there's nuances to all of it, and I don't know. I haven't done all of their programs, so I don't know all of them deeply. We do have a coach in our program who leads people through a lot of processes, who's done the Primal Trust work, and then we have another coach who's done the Gupta work. So, that's what we have in our program. But our program is more basic. We do have a basic and more advanced version, but it's not just a standalone nervous system retraining program. So it is not as in-depth as these other ones.
Gotcha. And Dawn, I'm curious what markers you see for it.
What do you mean by that, Dawn?
So I guess my question is really about, I come to you because I'm really exhausted, I'm really tired, and I'm not sleeping well, and my joints are very achy. They weren't. I've kind of lost my mojo. Um, I, I had COVID a couple years ago, but I've done okay. But I recently just had the flu again, and it really hit me hard, but I can't get back up. And so, um, like I'm very interested in this area of life of where our head meets our body, or our brain work hits our physiology. And so when you first say I'm talking to you and I know you have nervous system dysregulation, Like that's just automatic, like because we all do. And so then you dig it. So there's no marker for it necessarily. It's just that I don't feel well. And then you start to dig in and ask the questions to do the work that like your program does. And these, is that the way that works? There's no trigger that makes you think, oh, we got some nervous system problems here, but because everybody just has them now.
Exactly.
That's what I was
Yeah.
asking.
Yeah, it's more the latter. Yeah, there aren't any markers that I know of because the reality is that people relate to stressors differently. So
Right.
that one person who had physical abuse may actually have a more positive and healthier outlook about life and have a better nervous system than somebody who was rejected by their peer group, right? So which may be considered more mild. But yeah, so everybody has it. And that's kind of simplified a lot of things for me and allowed me to get more people well, is just being like,
Yeah.
is that understanding that everybody's got the toxic five. We're going to address it all. We're not going to miss anything, and I'm going to get more people well. And it doesn't cost more to do that, essentially. I mean, it's going to cost a couple more supplements and you do the nervous system retraining, but it's totally worth it because everybody gets better.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Great.
That's just incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Evan Du. So appreciate it. Karen has a question. Common mistakes people or providers make when caring for chronic fatigue.
So I think the biggest thing is what they miss. So most providers are not going to address the toxic five. So they're going to address, and so I think since you came late, I'm just going to share my screen just to kind of expedite this a little bit. So in terms of the different causes that we're looking at, these are all the deficiencies of the things that are not in the body that should be. And then these are all the toxicities, with these being the toxic five, the ones that are in bold. And the reality is that the toxic five has caused 80% of these deficiencies, everything really except for the lifestyle habits. And so, most practitioners are focused on replacing the deficiencies because they can get 90% of the people who walk through their door better by doing that, right? But not a lot really want to or need to go after heavy metals or chemicals or molds or infections or nervous system dysfunction, because I mentioned previously that this is like getting a PhD, which is what I had to do in order to get better. And so consequently, they don't need to go into this. And so they don't. I never wanted to. I did not want to have to deal with Lyme. I always thought oh my gosh, that's so complicated. I don't ever want to have to deal with it. And then I had to deal with it, right? Same thing with mold, right? So a lot of, regular functional medicine or integrative docs will deal maybe a little bit with heavy metals, but these other ones they're not necessarily addressing. And they're definitely not addressing all of them. And you're going to spend a lot of money on laboratory work, which, as I mentioned previously, really isn't going to be that beneficial. So I do recommend you go back if you missed that part of it, Karen, and rewatch this, because I spoke very quickly and talked about a lot of things. So so hopefully you can kind of slow it down, but hopefully that helps a little bit. And then my 4-step process is figuring out what the causes are for each individual, because besides the toxic five and the adrenals and the mitochondria, which we address with everybody, there are other nuances. So we do have to personalize this. And then we replace the deficiencies, we open up the exit pathways, and then we remove the toxicities. And that's where the majority of where you want to spend your time doing is removing the toxic five.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Evan, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and information with us today. We do so appreciate it. Don't forget, grab his gift. I just posted the link again in the chat for you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on. Great event you got here, Pamela. Keep up the good work.